Egon squeezed his city-issued 3x5 card, fraying it at the corners with his sweaty fingers. A knot steadily formed in his throat as the numerated lottery balls bounced in a large glass box on the television screen. He sat on the very edge of the couch, digging his heels so deep into the carpet that his toes were losing sensation. A woman in a bedazzled gold dress stood next to the box with her arms akimbo. A sash ran from her shoulders to her waist, identifying her as Miss California. The mayor of Los Angeles stood next to her. His eyes were set too close together above a piggish nose. His top lip disappeared into a broomy mustache. He squinted at the camera and grinned. The mayor's third chin was tucked into his collar, tightly held together by a red, white, and blue tie. Miss California swooped her head to the side, bouncing her hair on her shoulders. She leaned to the camera and pursed her collagen lips.
And the next number of the Los Angeles Drought Lotto is...
A ball bounced into the top compartment on the glass box. Its number turned away from the camera. Mayor O'Neill lifted the lid, examined the red ball, and announced the next number.
11.
He called. Egon's stomach twisted. 4 of the 5 called numbers were animated on the bottom of the television screen. 5, 13, 1, and 11. Egon twisted his card as if bending it would change his assigned numbers. He bit his bottom lip until he tasted blood. He looked at the ceiling and begged God, his son, the Virgin Mother, and all the saints to stop time. The balls bounced in the glass box. Egon turned the volume all the way down as Miss California addressed the camera. A green ball popped into the top compartment of the glass box. Egon squeezed his eyes shut and hugged himself, gripping his shoulders. Neither did this stop his heart from racing and his head from spinning. He swallowed hard and opened his eyes. 5 numbers spun on the bottom of the screen. Cheesy animated fireworks exploded behind them. 5, 13, 1, 11, and 6. Egon Bogosian of Atwater Village flashed on the screen in red, white, and blue font. Egon screamed and fell forward off the couch. He reached his arm out to stop himself, sending it through the glass top of his coffee table. The shattered glass ripped open his flesh as he reflectively pulled his arm out. He held his wound against his chest as he ran to the front door. He'd take off on foot without shoes, with only the money in his pocket and the clothes on his back. Egon opened the front door as news vans screeched up to his front lawn. They were followed by police cars with lights flashing but sirens off. The van doors slid open. Anchors in gaudy suits ran up his lawn carrying corded microphones bearing the names of their associated networks, followed closely by wheezing cameramen. Egon slammed the door and headed for the back of the house. He cut through the living room into the kitchen, leaving a trail of blood behind him. He swung open the back door only to find photographers climbing over his fence and advancing toward him. Cameras held to their faces, blinding him with flashes. The linoleum kitchen floor felt mushy and his knees buckled. Egon wailed as he collapsed on the back steps.
Dear citizens of this great city,
Mayor O'Neill spoke from the podium inside a fenced-in area. Multiple news affiliate microphones were crowded on top of and around each other in front of him. A large audience listened on the browned, burned-out front lawn of City Hall. Egon stood on the side of the temporary stage, flanked on both sides by police officers.
As you well know, we are in our record-breaking 412th week of drought in this fair city. Trees have lost their leaves. Front yards have gone unwatered. Backyard pools are evaporating to dangerous, joyless, shallow depths. We're in our 368th week of water restrictions. And I don't know about you, but I'm sick and tired of 1-minute showers.
His voice echoed from loudspeakers that were set at every corner of the lawn. People shouted back with cheers. The mayor continued.
The people spoke and we listened. After months of negotiation, the city, with the blessing of the state and federal government, came to a landmark bipartisan agreement. I want to thank each and every voter out there who exercised their democratic duty and voted in our snap election, showing overwhelming support for our solution to bring water to this, our scorched earth.
Early signs of disorder began rippling through the crowd like choppy seas. The citizens were whipping themselves into a frenzy.
We have not only listened to the wisdom of our forefathers, but we have listened to the wisdom of our forefathers' fathers. I present to you Egon Bogosian, a citizen among citizens who was freely and fairly chosen to sacrifice his life so bravely to the heavens so that the clouds might open themselves back up to us once again. Gentlemen, bring in the truck.
A flatbed truck inched through the crowd, met with crazy applause. A camouflage net hid the bulky contents of its trailer. It stopped for a moment, then did a 3-point turn. Police officers opened the fence to let it in, and the truck came to a halt. 2 soldiers got out of the olive green cab, swinging open doors decorated with white 5-point stars. National Guard troops parted the crowd as 5 city workers walked down the lawn toward the truck. Police officers made a gap in the fence to let them in, quickly closing it behind them. A city worker pulled himself onto the flatbed. He knelt down to help the other men up. They surrounded the camouflage net and awaited further instructions. The crowd fell silent.
Gentlemen, reveal the apparatus,
cried the mayor. In one motion, the men pulled off the net, revealing the terrible machine beneath. The crowd screamed in ecstasy. People threw their hands to the heavens. Men wept, thanking their gods. The audience fell into disorder as the citizens gave way to mass hysteria. A beer bottle soared over the front of the crowd and hit a city worker in the forehead. He staggered back, flailing his arms like a Looney Tunes character, and fell off the truck. At once, the crowd descended into pandemonium. Police officers locked arms and protected the fenced-in enclosure as violence erupted all around them. People swung at one another, pushing to get a closer look. News helicopters roared overhead, dangerously crowding the airspace. Egon hardly noticed the chaos unfolding around him. His eyes were fixed on the apparatus, laying on its side, tied down by ropes. His limbs quivered, rattling his chains. SWAT vans surrounded the lawn, unloading squads of riot police. They held bulletproof shields to their chests and shot tear gas into the fray. The crowd slowly dispersed as order was restored. The 5 city employees worked through the night to set up the apparatus. By sunrise, they were packing up their tools. They formed a circle around their work, clapped each other on the back for a job well done, and headed toward the fence. Police officers opened the gate to let them out. Egon's left wrist and feet were shackled in heavy chains, locked to a leather belt around his waist. His injured arm throbbed, set in a tight sling. A leather collar choked his neck, attached to a long steel chain padlocked to a wood post that was hammered into the dry ground. The foreman stayed behind and turned to approach Egon.
Hey there, buddy. Thank you for your service,
he said, stretching out his hand for a shake. The man stood at an even 5 feet, wider than he was tall. His large, bald head wobbled on a too thin neck. He had a sizable Adam's apple and a sweating goiter beneath his right ear. He wore a yellow hard hat that fit so tightly it looked like it would pop off, like a cap on a shaken-up bottle of soda. Egon refused the handshake. The man put his arms on his hips and looked up.
Yeah, buddy, that's some honest-to-God craftsmanship right there.
He stared down Egon as if waiting to be congratulated. Silence hung between them. Egon cupped his hand over his eyes and stared up at the horrible rig. It was shaped like a lowercase t and was the size of a telephone pole. A large 50-gallon glass container filled halfway with water was suspended by ropes from the perpendicular beam. It rocked back and forth in the lazy afternoon breeze. A steel spout stuck out of the bottom of the vessel, bent at the middle toward Egon. It was akin to water bottles found in hamster cages, however human size. The water spout dangled 2 feet out of reach above Egon's head, and the city had provided a wobbly discount step stool from IKEA so that he might reach it. His tongue was swollen, and his dry lips had begun to crack. Unity in Thirst was painted in big block letters on the glass in red, white, and blue. The foreman put his hand on Egon's shoulder.
Okay, so let me give you the rundown, partner. The bottle right there, that's sealed up. So once you finish the last drop, that's it. Finito. Then I guess we, I guess we all just wait for you to, and then maybe the rain will,
The foreman trailed off and looked at the ground.
Really, I don't know why they're giving you water in the first place, but, maybe something about suffering will make God, or, maybe if it hurts, God will, See, buddy, look, we could use the rain. We voted.
The foreman stopped himself, stared at the sky with his mouth wide open, and clenched his eyes shut. He took a deep breath, then blasted a wet sneeze against his armpit.
Gesundheit.
A police officer called over his shoulder. Egon felt the world spin in dehydrated delirium.
Well,
The foreman exclaimed while slapping his belly.
that was a long-ass night, I tell you what. The wife, you better have breakfast ready. And, later days, amigo.
He said, patting Egon on the shoulder. The police let the foreman out of the gates.
Thank you for your service.
The foreman said to the officers before walking away. Egon looked up at the torturous apparatus. Thirst strangled his throat, but he wasn't yet ready to suffer the indignity of drinking water like a caged rodent. For now, he still held out hope that it might rain. Egon sat on the ground and pulled at the dead grass. The next morning, Egon sat cross-legged, staring up at the water bottle when he heard his name shouted in the distance.
Mr. Bogosian! Mr. Bogosian!
Egon sat up. A towering man in a gray suit charged towards the gate, followed by 2 police officers struggling to keep up.
Mr. Bogosian!
The man stopped. Egon got up and walked to him until he was choked by his leash. The man cupped his hand on his forehead to shield his eyes from the sun. His dark hair was set in a severe part, and his bright red tie was buttoned to his shirt with a pearl.
I'm Hideki Yamada, Esquire. I'll be representing you. Please, don't get up.
I'm already standing, Egon replied.
Well, it's a figure of speech, Mr. Bogosian.
Mr. Amada, can you do... Hideki raised his hand to silence him.
Mr. Bogosian, we don't have much time, so let me do the talking. First things first, don't take a sip of that water. Our team is going to argue cruel and unusual punishment, and if you take so much as a little sip, our case is dead in the water. Ha! Dead in the water, pardon the pun. If you drink, it's not so cruel, now is it? So if we can win that angle, you'll be free.
But... Hideki raised his finger.
However, seeing your sacrifice was approved by the snap election, this might not be so easy. We might have to explore other options.
Such as... Hideki rolled his eyes.
Maybe a faster way of doing this. Guillotine, firing squad. Who knows? Whatever the judge decides. I'll take the position that it's the sacrifice, not the mode of sacrifice, that will please our gods and make it rain once again. And if that fails, well, sorry, Charlie. At least we tried, am I right?
Hideki smiled. I don't...
Don't worry, Mr. Bogosian. We'll settle payment later. And don't lose any sleep over this. I've fought hundreds of cases like this.
He smiled with his top lip and picked at his front teeth. There have been hundreds of cases like this, asked Egon.
Well, no, Mr. Bogosian, not like this. It's a figure of speech, but stay strong.
He shouted, holding a fist in the air. Hideki turned around and snapped his fingers at the cops.
Let's go, boys. I have a case to win.
He marched off the lawn and into City Hall. Egon snapped awake to competing voices shouting into megaphones. Dehydration left him feeling like a steel spike was twisting into his forehead. Explosive pain blew through his head as the megaphones whined with feedback. He slowly rose to his feet, patting dust and dirt off his ragged clothes. He hadn't yet drank, holding out hope in Hideki Yamada. Egon rubbed his eyes as the scene before him slowly came into focus. 2 people stood on apple boxes on either side of the fenced-in enclosure, with a distance of about 20 feet between them. Each had their own small crowd gathered in front of them, holding signs and shouting with support between the speakers' dramatic pauses. On Egon's left, a woman had her back turned to him. The crowd before her chanted, holding signs in support of Egon. They read, "Hold on, Egon. We all thirst. Don't give in." And strangely, "Free hugs." On the right, a different crowd was gathered. The speaker had his back to Egon, and he was profusely sweating through a striped blue suit. His expensive haircut dovetailed in the back, firmly set in place with ozone-depleting hairspray. His audience held signs of their own in support of Egon. They read, "Make it rain," Genesis 7:4, "Don't give in," and, strangely, "Live, laugh, love." Egon staggered to the speaker on his left, dragging his chains behind him.
Egon will stay strong. Egon will fight. Egon won't take one little sip. And Egon will give up his life for us,
She cried. Ecstatic cheers came from her audience. Egon walked as close as he could to the fence and shouted, "Get me out!" The speaker continued.
We, us, all of us here today, we are making history.
Egon shouted louder.
Help! Because this is the day we stood up and cried, "Let it rain."
I know you can hear me.
The leader moved her hands behind her back and waved it, shooing Egon away. Exasperated, he threw his good hand in the air and dragged his chains toward the other podium.
Isn't it magical? Aren't we lucky? In our lifetime, a martyr who didn't give in to temptation with even one little sip, laying down his life so that we might drink.
The audience testified.
Praise him! Bless you, Egon! Not a sip!
The man gestured to the circle of police.
I think we owe these boys in blue a round of applause for keeping us safe here today.
Insane applause erupted from the crowd. Egon cried to him.
Please, get me.
The man turns to Egon. His cheekbones were too high, and his eyes were pulled up, set in a permanent squint from plastic surgery. "Don't steal my thunder, fucker," he whispered. The man turned back to the crowd.
Egon just personally thanked me. He's done for us, and us alone.
Shouted the crowd. The man took a dramatic bow. A flock of news anchors elbowed their way through the audience. Egon jumped up and down, waving his arm to get their attention. But they stopped far short of the fence and interviewed the speakers instead. Both sides followed their leaders and flocked around them for a chance at being on TV. Egon's eyes were too dry to well with tears. He choked as he tried to swallow his foamy saliva. His throat felt like it was as wide as a cocktail straw. While the audience was busy with the cameras, he backed towards the step stool and dragged it to the water bottle. He took one step and crouched, checking to make sure the coast was clear. All eyes were on the cameras. He stood on the top step, lifted his mouth to the spout, and stuck his tongue to the steel when,
Egon, no!
Egon flinched and fell backward off the stool.
Don't give in!
A voice screamed. The crowd exploded into madness. Police locked arms to protect the gates from the rising insanity. Rocks started to rain into the enclosure. Egon stood up with his hands in the air to stop them, but got pelted in the stomach and collapsed to the ground.
Don't worry, Egon!
An elderly voice shouted.
Don't give in!
Followed another. Egon pushed himself up to his knees, catching his breath, when a brick flew over the fence. It hit the step stool on its back leg. The cheap plastic shattered to pieces. The people cheered. The water bottle swayed in the breeze, its spout out of reach. With the stool broken and the drama of will he take a sip rendered moot, Egon's struggle was no longer newsworthy. Within 24 hours of the rally, the only people left on the lawn were city workers cleaning up the trash left behind. Every so often, a person would approach the gate, turn their back to Egon, and take a selfie with him. Hallucinations became common. Flocks of doves would land all around him, perching themselves on his shoulders. When he'd shake them off, they'd disappear. He'd dream he was in the middle of a rainstorm and even feel water dripping off his nose. But when he awoke, it'd be just as dry as when he had dozed off. Egon watched as a towering figure marched toward him, followed by 2 police officers who jogged to keep up. He was sure it was another hallucination, until the man shouted to get his attention, snapping Egon out of his trance.
Mr. Bogosian! Mr. Bogosian, I have great news!
It was Hideki Yamada. He held a leather briefcase and had a huge grin set on his face.
I met with the mayor and the legislator. Whee! Oh, it was a fight, let me tell you. But I'll tell you what, people are going to remember the name Hideki Yamada after this. Yes, sir, they will.
Hideki looked up and whistled.
Ooh, not a cloud in the sky, but that's all right, Mr. Bogosian. The fight is over.
Rasped Egon.
Save your strength, Mr. Bogosian. I'll be brief. I got the mayor and the city legislator, both sides of the aisle, to agree to hear your case. Isn't that wonderful?
Hideki clenched his hand into a fist and shook it victoriously. Egon felt lightheaded. So, I'm free?
What?
Hideki's face dropped.
Well, no, not exactly. Even better. I got both parties, both sides of the aisle, to agree to hear your case when they reconvene to legislate in the fall. How spectacular!
Hideki jumped in the air and clicked his heels like a cartoon character. Egon's head dropped and he slunk to the ground. He laid on his side and rolled over, turning his back to Hideki Yamada. Hideki walked to the fence and shook it.
Mr. Bogosian. Mr. Bogosian.
He shook harder.
I believe a thank you is in order,
shouted Hideki Yamada. Egon shut his eyes. He swore he heard water flowing beneath the ground. Egon dug madly at the dirt in the moonlight. He heard water rushing beneath him. Perhaps only a stream. No, it was too loud. Surely it was a river. An entire underground river of water flowing into the ocean. He untied his sling and pulled off the gauze, ripping open a crisscross of jagged cuts. Egon dug with both hands in a crazed frenzy. He dug until his fingernails bled and finally began popping off. He burrowed deeper and deeper as the sound of rushing water got louder. After hours of digging, he finally stopped to take a breath. He dug a sizable hole in the dirt, so deep that the lawn was feet above his head. As he panted to catch his breath, he could no longer hear the rushing water. All he heard was the heaving squeak of the giant water bottle in the breeze. When he settled himself, he tried to climb back out, but he couldn't stand the pain of his bleeding fingertips. Egon sat back down in the hole and nodded off. Egon dreamt that water was streaming down his face and was awoken by a thunderclap. He licked his lips and opened his eyes. Egon tasted water. He began to cry in frustration over yet another hallucination when another clap of thunder exploded in the sky. He grabbed at his hair. It was soaked. Egon looked to the sky as a bolt of lightning screamed through the clouds. It was actually raining. This was the real deal. Egon tried to shout for joy, but his throat was still too parched to make any noise. He attempted to stand, but his legs were too weak. He sat cross-legged in the hole with his mouth in the air, greedily slurping the rain. While Egon drank, he felt the water rise up from his knees to his waist. Water was rushing from the dry lawn into his hole, far above his head, filling it quickly. Panic set in. Egon tried to stand, but fell face first with a splash. He gasped, sucking water into his lungs. He coughed without ceasing as more water flooded in. Egon willed his body to fight and get up, but he was too weak to move. The water rose quickly, over his shoulders and up to his chin. He tilted his head back and took one last breath of air before he went under for good. After 3 days of rain, the same city workers who set up the apparatus arrived and broke it back down. They loaded its pieces onto the truck. The small foreman had the honor of hitting an axe against the water bottle, spilling the 50 gallons of water onto the mushy ground. A front loader drove up to Egon's hole, leaving a muddy trail in its wake. It filled the hole, patted it down until it was even with the lawn, did a 3-point turn, and drove off the wet grass. That night, news stations reported on the rainstorm. Despite the flash flooding, the reservoirs had begun to fill once again, and wildfires had been put out. Within a year, a memorial was erected over Egon's grave. It was of Hideki Amada, holding a briefcase in one hand and raising a fist in the air. The plaque read, "Hideki Amada, a servant of Los Angeles, uniter of this great city."
This story must be told.